kind of application of those on the ground, especially across kind of multiple touch points. You know, the designer would get, you know, the research document, flip through it, push it aside, and then do whatever they wanted anyways. And, you know, that seemed like a huge waste of time for us. So for us, you know, being able to kind of understand and translate a lot of those documents and then really kind of drive and work with each of the different design disciplines was kind of, I think, for us, where we kind of wanted to place ourselves right in the middle of that gap that was created by the promise of design thinking. So.
But, I mean, the other opportunity that we also saw was, you know, making sure that, yes, we approach stuff with a practical mentality, but at the same time, embrace intuition. And that's also the same thing between think and make, you know, really getting into the theory, but also the application side of things.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think the thing that we kind of stumbled upon, which was really interesting, was, you know, not shutting down creating processes when you're doing kind of a lot of the thinking stuff. So don't stop inventing stuff or doing prototypes or coming up with ideas when you're in research and strategy phases. That you should actually encourage that kind of thing and then reverse engineer why something really appeals to the team or appeals to consumers. You can kind of reverse engineer that into a strategy, so it can actually kind of work the other way. You should actually work kind of from both ends. And kind of work, you know, if you make this amazing little interactive or product prototype, you know, reverse engineer why you think that's right into kind of a strategy or why it would connect with the consumer. And so for us, it's that you can come at it from both ends. I think was kind of exciting. It doesn't have to be just this kind of linear process of, you know, starting with theory and then eventually moving to, okay, now we can start coming up with new ideas and then we start prototyping them later on. So, and, you know, I think for us, and I'm sure you're all like that too, we want our stuff to get out in the world and want people to use it. And so, you know, trying to do that more often and more frequently and kind of having all that activity and energy and money that goes into kind of those front end phases result in more things in the world that people can use and love. So.
Yeah, one of our big goals has always been whatever it is that we're delivering has to be actionable, whether it's messaging or whether it's the actual product. I mean, oftentimes in our industry with this bubble of design, we're starting to see that, you know, people come to you and they're almost requesting these recipe books or big strategy books, and, you know, they end up being these beautiful books on someone's desk, you know, and that's the one thing that we wanted to prevent. So in many ways, that's one of our big pillars and philosophies is whatever it is that we deliver has to be actionable.
So, you know, I think that's where we came up with this idea of a change in trade. So the design, I think there's a lot of trends right now, all the way from kind of, you know, meta trends about the role of design in the United States economy. I think there's an article and a whole issue of Fast Company that's dedicated to that, all the way down to kind of the tools that designers have to bring their own ideas to life. So, and, you know, doing that across disciplines, you know, so I think there's a lot of opportunity right now for designers. If you have an industrial design training or you have an interaction design training to kind of open up a little bit and rethink your role a little bit in the design process and what you're capable of and kind of the scope of your influence as well.
And, you know, one of the things that we're seeing, and we're not the first to mention this, but we're in actually an amazing transition right now where, you know, we're in an era that is completely unpredictable and there's a lot of rapid change that's happening. So one of the things that we're doing is embracing that, and rather than being stuck into our old mentalities of, well, this is the process, we're beginning to, as we said, prototype and figure out what is the best way to deal with this change. You know, in many ways, if we look at history and we look at all the movements that have happened, from the commodities to the agricultural to the industrial revolution to the digital and information revolution and beyond, they've all had just staggered right on top of each other to create just massive change that's constantly happening, and we're being bombarded with quite a bit of information, but at the same time a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, you know, that there's all these tools we have that were created during the processes created during the Industrial Revolution. You know, you do this tons of research and strategy to kind of figure out this one thing. You're going to invest millions of dollars in tooling, and you're going to make a million of those. And so, you know, it's really more about managing risk. That investment is about managing the risk to figure out that one thing to make. on the other side, you've got a kid in their basement, cranking out apps or a website, getting customers on the second day, adding new features, deleting features, and then closing the whole business down on the 5th day. So, it's more about just iteration, rapid prototyping, not being perfect, not being right, but just being kind of responsive and agile. And you're seeing that at companies like Google and Facebook, and it's a completely different set of tools and processes. And so I think what's happening right now, part of what's driving that change in trade is a clash of those two worlds, those old kind of risk-averse methods to figure out how to make something on a mass scale versus a lot of the digital techniques and tools to do things really quickly and iteratively and responsively. So I think that for us was a really exciting time. I think that's part of what drove our thinking behind the change in trade.
Especially in the digital realm, there's not just a reduce, there's basically zero barrier to manufacture. I mean, manufacturing is me publishing a website in my bedroom. Like, I don't need to go to Asia to manufacture a business, right? So I can get that up, like you said, in 24 hours. And the next great idea could come from this room, right? And it could threaten, Intel's digital business or Nike's digital services. It doesn't really require the same kind of edifice of manufacture that it used to.
And what's really driving that is the fact that we are beyond connected. We've almost become a village once again, where any little movement that happens here, just the way that it just publishes and the way that it gets judged becomes so fast. So therefore, there's almost been a new demand, and it's this demand that we're calling transparency, where we're starting to see the consumers look for an authentic solution or an authentic innovation, because they are so sophisticated in the way that any idea is being judged. And really, I mean, the area that we're at right now, it is that idea revolution. As we talked about earlier, I mean, you have people creating apps, you have people manufacturing products instantly through rapid prototyping, and then you have a lot of services and systems that are empowering makers and doers to create one-offs. I mean, if we look at the power of Kickstarter and also even Quirky, and if we look at how fast things are being digested and created, it's actually quite remarkable.
Yeah, and I think historically there was the idea of the Great American Novel, but I think now it's Great American Startup or Great American App. So everyone's got an app idea now instead of a novel idea, and they want to be able to launch that. So I think it's kind of fun to think about tapping into that creativity. It's more at the grassroots level, and be able to kind of help people realize those ideas. Instead of writing them a book.
And what that starts to bring is, we are at an era where it's, for any brand, whether you're an established brand or a startup, is this kind of push to either you have to innovate or you break. And by that I mean, like, you create a meaningful change or you fall apart. An example, and that's why I kind of have American Apparel up there. If we look at like their old philosophy of just the basics and then how they try to expand into just plugging in hose, it kind of brought to their demise a bit. Along with that, I mean, we're starting to see a lot of deaths with brands, right? I mean, let's look at Blockbuster and then the lack of brand loyalty that we're starting to see out there.
What's crazy is you could probably put Netflix up there now too, just supposedly killed Blockbuster. So
and births as well. I mean, we're starting to see new ways of creating icons, new ways of becoming brands themselves, right? And with that, a lot of these things are being moved towards what I call magic portals or smartphones or tablets and so on, because all of a sudden everything is just instant. So you're starting to see these movements happen instantly in your hand. And you're being allowed to curate all that stuff, where you're being allowed to kind of digest and see, okay, this is what I want access to and this is what I don't want access to. And in general, one of the things that we're starting to see as well is this experience overload. If we look at about a year ago or even 3 years ago, even within our industry, there was this, everyone was trying to sell the idea of creating experiences. And now that everyone is creating experiences, there's been a bit of a whiplash. And that whiplash is this new demand for tangible value, this new demand for stuff that actually matters. And we're starting to see that with a lot of consumers, and especially embraced by your Gen Y culture. And with that, there's also a craving for the unconventional. Oftentimes when people are innovating or they have these formulas to innovate, they oftentimes step just a little step forward, and it's just a little conventional idea. But we're starting to see that the unconventional, the true thinking differently, is what's starting to really inspire people. And I always say, like, when we're creating or we're designing, it's important to meet a consumer's needs. It's very important, but at the same time, inspire them. And I think now more than ever, we're starting to see them embrace that. So, I mean, as a result, just seeing some of the counter trends is to all this information, and again, this tangible value that we're talking about. You know, there's a lot of sites that are doing something interesting, you know, and the slide that says keep it real. I mean, you have this all of a sudden crave to look at sites that are, you know, literally keeping it real, taking photography or grabbing people in the movement or grabbing people in the environment as they're created, and not necessarily, again, creating these huge experiences around them. We're starting to see a drive towards reminiscence, right? We're starting to see a lot of people look backwards to look forwards. You know, a lot of people who haven't even experienced some of the old things to say, oh, wait a second, but I want to make sure I have this. So one of the things that we're starting to see is a lot of revivals with many products and brands. And with that, there's also a demand for value when it comes to, you know, the locally created. Locally is definitely better. We're seeing this drive of this new Americana, this thing of, you know, buying something that actually means something to you and that'll carry on and that it's sourced close by. And with that, you're starting to see this welcoming back of makers, people that are hands-down craftsmen. And again, it's a counter trend to what we're starting to see with all this crazy bombardment of information.
Yeah, there's an interesting, you know, the kind of idea of reshoring manufacturing. Again, there's definitely a trend, especially in design, but also manufacturing, of making things locally again, finding local sources, you know, sources that are in the country you're in, which is definitely counter to 5 years ago when it was just kind of assumed you would go overseas to get something made. So those venues are open. People are kind of open to paying a little bit more for that stuff, and you know, those businesses are kind of starting to thrive again.
You know, the other thing when we're talking about over experience, how everyone wants to navigate you through this experience of opening something. Sometimes now we're starting to see people drive towards the basics. Just call it what it is. Just, again, this is that drive of transparency. You don't have to take me through this whole thing. It's just a sandwich. You know what I mean? Just call it what it is, right? And people are starting to gravitate towards that.
Yeah, this actually goes back to, you know, kind of pre-World War II advertising. A lot of the advertising was really benefit-based. There's a great documentary called, I think it's called The Art of Advertising, something like that, History of Advertising maybe. But it talks about how, you know, most advertising back then was benefit-based. It just talked about the product and the benefits of the product, and kind of through World War II and the process of selling the war to people, a lot of this lifestyle advertising kind of came out, where it was a product in the context of lifestyle, was the way you sold something. And I think what we're seeing is kind of going back to a focus on the value of the benefit of the product to the consumer again, rather than trying to, you know, wrap a beach scene of someone, you know, jogging down a beach and what is the product they're selling again. So a movement away from that kind of superficial selling of something back to, like, well, what do I get from this? You know, you're asking me to fill out an online profile and, you know, go down to some place, you know, store somewhere, and then I get a chance to win something. You know, come on, it's too much. So give me a fair value for the effort I'm putting in, and just tell me what I get again.
And with that, you're starting to see backlashes. And yes, this slide's a little bit old, but it is, you know, it's just an example of how empowered we are as consumers. You know, you guys remember when Tropicana launched that new graphic campaign, and people were just didn't have it and were willing to state their voice and backlash behind it. So that's kind of what we're beginning to see just in general, right?
So, I think, a lot of the kind of thinking that went behind how we're going to work and the people we work with and the place we work kind of brought us back to this idea of being adaptive. And, I don't know, even though they're capitalized, I don't know if I'd actually officially call it adaptive innovation, but it's an idea like being more agile or adaptive in your process. It's not about kind of going through the checkbox steps. It's about really kind of looking at all the information that's there and being responsive to the bulk of information you have, the complexity of the problems that you might be trying to solve. And then as you kind of go through the design process, be able to handle new inputs into the process or changes in the market context and be able to respond to that really quickly, as opposed to understanding everything first and then kind of solving the problem after that. It's about solving the problem all the way through the process. And I think the truth is there really isn't like a blueprint to design and innovation. It has to do with a lot of intangible stuff, and I think this is probably work to be done on defining what is design and what is innovation. But it has more to do with kind of the mindset of the people, the way you work together, your ability to kind of be flexible and solve problems, be a flexible thinker.
I think the point is that design process or process by itself or methodology by itself doesn't guarantee you anything, doesn't create anything, doesn't create innovation. It's not productive. Like methodology it constrains chaos, but it doesn't actually generate an idea. So like probably the best example of methodology might be like the scientific method, right? So it constrains subjective thinking or junky thinking, and it's like a checklist. Like your theories are reproducible, verifiable. It's not subjective, but it doesn't create or innovate anything, right? A lot of the greatest discoveries, maybe most of them, in science, medicine, have actually been serendipitous, just sort of accidental things happening in a laboratory, in a sort of like a creative, let's call it an environment, where penicillin was a bit of mold on a piece of bread that was killing a petri dish full of bacteria that the guy was actually trying to study. Pasteur maybe was trying to study. X-ray, same thing, like exposing a bit of photographic film. Kind of serendipitous stuff that is not really like a dirty word. Like we should maybe start to embrace that serendipity of our process a little bit, instead of fear that will scare clients away by saying, it admits a bit of risk, I suppose, to say that let people at it, let people have their way with the problem for a good solid chunk of time, instead of saying the guaranteed path to innovation will be like 2 months of research, 2 months of ideation, followed by 2 months of design ideas and then refinement. That process will not guarantee anything.
And for us, I mean, earlier on, what I was saying about embracing the practical and the intuitive, that's a great example of it. I think oftentimes you have, and we learn this through, you see a lot of the bigger agencies or a lot of the even corporations try to sell this process. Like, here, if you get this, you will innovate. And we've learned over time, over our experience, that that's not necessarily true. That's not really how things work.
Yeah, and so I think what's challenging, I think, I find this challenging, I don't know about you guys, but when you really have a team that can be agile in their thinking and their kind of prototyping processes and their design process, you can solve a really complex problem in a day. It might take you a year, it might take you a day, but I think that's really hard to communicate to people, that uncertainty. Like, hey, we may solve this in the first few days of working with you, but it may take us 3 months. We don't know for sure. And for me, it's that kind of agility, that ability to solve problems really quickly if you can understand the complete context and then solve that really quickly. The ability to do that and move forward, as opposed to stick to, well, we said we'd do 3 to 4 weeks for phase 1 and
I think
3
the key
weeks
is
for phase 2.
There really is no guarantee in no matter what the process. If there were, like going back to a scientific method for a second, if there were a guaranteed result, then we'd already have a cure for cancer, right? It's not just you do this process of research and development and trial and error, and sometimes maybe you don't come up with something. Sometimes it's a day, sometimes it's 6 months, and maybe the answer is some things just don't have a magic innovation waiting, or their time is not now. There's risk involved.
So I think for us, that this idea of adaptive and be able to kind of touch everything and prototype everything really quickly multiple times is more valuable than running through a linear process. And I even think about it physically. The linear process is kind of marching down this kind of stair step, but for me the adaptive is you're sitting at the core of the problem and you're touching on brand, you're touching on consumer, you're touching on product strategy, industrial design, interaction design, but you always come back to that thing you're making and kind of iterating and prototyping on that, as opposed to getting distracted off in one of those kind of peripheral activities. So you don't end up with just a brand strategy or just a consumer research target. You're actually iterating on the thing the company's going to make money on.
Yeah, I think what we saw was that with this growth and spotlight of design, many designers and many organizations began to get really conditioned on process. And by being conditioned on process, they were scared I might skip the step. When that's not necessarily true. If you are researching, it's okay to prototype some of your ideas. It's okay to stress test it. You don't have to wait till the research is over. You can go in there, and actually that's when most of your ideas are actually happening. Instead of, wait, I have to finish my research, then it's time to ideate,
Right.
Then it's time to build hands-on mock-ups, then it's time to do this, then it's time to that.
Yeah, or you might want to do some research at the end of that process as opposed to the beginning, that you don't want to be constrained by that stage is over, right?
So, this idea that kind of great brands are built from the inside out kind of resonated with us. It kind of matches that metaphor of being kind of, centered on that problem you're trying to solve, the product or interaction piece of software or the service you're trying to design, being kind of centered and focused on that. And iterating and building that, and then having that affect the brand strategy or the consumer target, as opposed to as an addition to the other way around. And I think that is as valid a way to build a brand as a theoretical brand strategy that uses kind of abstract words and ideas to then drive a design process. They're both valuable, and I think it's good to think more about the making of things, the kind of making of the thing that the company is going to sell in the end to make money for revenue. Think more about that and less about the abstract stuff. And for us, that prototyping is the foundation of that whole process. And I think when I talked earlier about prototyping your brand strategy, your consumer target, doing that on the first day, in the first hour, do a quick touch on everything like that and come up with your hypothesis. Don't be afraid to do that. Prototype. What you think the product should be the first day, but then be willing to kind of iterate and change that as more information comes in. If you do end up doing research, be willing to throw that all out and revise your hypotheses. And a lot of the ethic of our business or us personally is this idea of making complex things simple, but not oversimplifying them. Also making them kind of sweet. That richness of the experience is still in there. It's not purely logic driven. You got a little bit of the love in there still, and I think when you're centered in this kind of strategy gap, there's an overwhelming amount of information, almost too much information to solve a design problem. So a lot of your job is to really kind of simplify a lot of that complexity in a way that's understandable and meaningful for people that are actually going to put pen to paper, metaphorically in the end.
So if we get to some examples of what we're starting to see, this adaptive thinking or approach, this slide that you see here actually of a Chrysler ad that was created by Wyden, which is fantastic, where they just called it like it is. And this is back to that transparency, right? Where, they said Detroit is crap. We know it. The automotive industry is crap. And there's absolutely no other way but up. And people love that transparency. People gravitate towards that, and it's a nice whiplash of what we're starting to see, right? Similar to that, someone who has embraced the culture that they have created and has continued to evolve it has been the Ace Hotel. One of their core things that they wanted to do is bring people together, bring the creative, bring the influencers together, and continue to evolve them and continue to see pockets where there's opportunity to creating these great communities that continue to push things. On a bigger brand, if we look at Xbox, if we look at the Xbox Connect, when they first launched that technology, they weren't necessarily aware that all the hackers were going to embrace it, and they weren't necessarily aware that people were going to try different things with it. But as they started seeing that a lot of people were hacking into this and actually evolving it, they left it open.
Yeah, some of us in this room were at IDSA recently, and Carl Ledbetter was sharing this story with us from the Xbox group, that literally within hours of releasing Xbox in Europe, someone had cracked the back USB port and found a way to get the data stream out of the camera and sort of the kinematics of people moving in front of the camera, and was immediately released that on the internet, and people were already starting to write little project code things having to do with.
I think they initially tried to shut it down, right?
So within Microsoft, apparently it was. So small fury was unleashed about like, how did you spend years developing security around this thing, and within hours some kid breaks it in, and rather than try to shut it down, I think not that they really had a choice because they couldn't. They did the smart thing and just came out publicly to embrace it, and devoted internal resources to developing an SDK to put out there to say, not only has someone cracked it, but like we'll actually write code for you to make it easier to do your art projects, or just sort of weird art science experimentation with this exciting new technology. It's kind of a subset. It's not really hurting their business. No one's like cutting into the game market this way, but it's a story of adapt or die, and they were smart enough to quickly adapt and not shut it down, but rather embrace it.
Another interesting, and oftentimes when people do these presentations, they never really give props to other design companies or agencies that are doing some exciting stuff. And for us, Domin Design has been doing some great work. I mean, they're kind of masters in real-time visualization and really being able to show how things constantly change and how things constantly move. I mean, this is an older example here of the 2010 Music Awards, where as people were looking or tweeting certain artists, visually, these bubbles were popping up into what people were actually looking up, which that's just a fantastic example of being able to embrace how things are happening at the time.
Yeah, and I think for me, this is a whole area, visualizing information that just is barely getting tapped right now. There's just so much data that's being collected in the world with all the sensors being put everywhere, and we're not yet extracting the value we can out of that. And so that's all about, there's a lot of computer algorithms and synthesis of that, but then just visually making that meaningful to people so they can respond to that more quickly is an area I think we're just kind of starting to tap into. It's for me a pretty exciting area. And if you're a graphic designer, industrial designer, it's something I'd be exploring for sure, like these guys are.
The other, a little bit more of a subculture brand, but Supreme, I think, the way that they've redefined swagger as far as growing with their consumer. They started as a kind of underground skateboarding, kind of urban brand, but as their consumers were growing up and getting a little bit more sophisticated, they did with them as well, which is great to see. It doesn't, oftentimes you do have an essence as a brand, but it's also important to know when to shift it and when to move it. And these guys did a fantastic job in doing so. A bigger brand that we know that's a local one is Nike, and they've done a fantastic job in not only continuing to innovate, but knowing that people are looking for that value that we talked about, that meaningful value. I mean, they could have easily launched those Back to the Future shoes just by themselves, right? They could have easily said, okay, we have this new technology that lights up, Power Laces 2015, whatever. But instead, they related it to Parkinson's, which is a great way to, again, create value and create meaning to the future innovations that they're doing. So, and another little movement that we found really interesting was this EcoBat. Ecovative, yeah.
Evocative, we're not sure.
Evocative, Ecovative.
Yeah, this company kind of blows your mind, and not because they're necessarily going to solve the world's problems, but it's just the sheer kind of creative thinking behind using mushroom roots to make packaging for products, and just being able to make that connection is pretty amazing. And the fact that what they're trying to do now is so they basically use industrial agricultural waste like seed husks and seed hulls, and then they use that as the kind of basis to grow mushroom roots, which is kind of mycelium, which is the white stuff there, into different shapes. And it has almost the same characteristics of styrofoam packaging. So it's completely uses a waste product, and it's completely biodegradable. The problem is the cycle times are days long, and so it's, instead of injection molding it in 5 seconds, it takes a few days to grow one of these. So they created like an amazing solution, but they're having challenges scaling it. But that's a problem to solve. That's again, bringing that kind of innovative thinking to like, okay, now we've got a different problem to solve than we've got all the styrofoam lying around. So there's just more companies like this that are thinking differently and kind of coming up with these just kind of mashups of there's a problem over here, but I'm gonna use this crazy thing over here and kind of solve that problem. So.
And then a bigger brand that we've seen just rise and kill it has been HTC, and with their new launch, they just launched this Rhyme phone where they're delivering to the minority. And when I say delivering to the minority, they focus completely on a female consumer, from really integrating the UI and the hardware to deliver on its promise. Not only on the phone but also the accessories. One of the interesting features that I saw here, which I thought was amazing, is that they have this little detail here, this little chime. And what happens is, oftentimes when someone has their phone in the purse, you don't feel it, you don't hear it. So what they do is they have this thing wrap around, and whenever you have a missed call or your phone is ringing, you can instantly see it. And just that little detail has been clever, the way that they really embrace that.
Just a little glowing LED that clips onto the outside of your purse. So if I have my phone in my pocket, I'm going to feel it vibrate. Women keep it in their purse, they're not going to feel it or hear it if you have it on silent. So it's a nice way to get that visibly out of the purse.
So for us, some of the examples that we're going to share, right now we can't really share a lot of the stuff that we're a new firm that we've been working with our clients, but we're going to share with you guys the way that we've been just embracing this idea of quickly adapting and prototyping. And one example is, we're in the process of launching this lifestyle brand, or this furniture brand called Raw. And what we're doing is we're really embracing the fact that we're surrounded by some great resources. But not only that, surrounded by some great reclaimed resources, looking at the quantity of reclaimed Oregon walnut, and really figuring out ways that tailoring some of this stuff to create some great lifestyle furniture. And to be able to do this along with some of our client work has been something that for us is, again, embracing the idea that we had and the opportunity, and just kind of adapting with it.
Yeah, and I think, for me, what's interesting, there's also some supply chain kind of innovations that we're looking at with this. We're collapsing the supply chain to make things more affordable and kind of more direct. And so I think we're kind of innovating not only kind of on the overall brand aesthetic and the kind of approach to it to furniture, but how it actually gets kind of sourced and delivered is kind of unique too.
And also embracing those imperfections. That's what we're calling it Raw. We're using raw materials. We're using, if there's dents or big knots, like just heroing them, and then rather than recreating, for example, metal stands, we're repurposing them and recasting them, and just creating these mashups that to us are very exciting. And
it's interesting. Pieces of wood like that would have been thrown out 10 years ago as being like unacceptable, right? I have a dining room table that we made that has bullets in it that are just from people shooting out in the forest, and these trees have been reclaimed, and it's like, no, that goes face up, that doesn't go face down, right? That's just part of the story. Just really cool story of the life of that tree.
The other advantage that we've had, and we've had the pleasure to do so, is to work with startups and really analyze the opportunity that we see there, and really get to see if there's actually a nugget there, and work with them and really try to bring some brands to life. So this is an example of a project that I may not get into too much detail, but it's going to be launching soon as well, and we're calling it Chatterbox, and it's basically an audio time capsule that we've created for a family consumer.
Yeah, and it's part of the fun here is just rethinking consumer electronics rather than coming at it from a technology standpoint. just coming at it from a purely reminiscent standpoint, which is remember the kind of tape recorders that you used to have when you were a kid and you used to record and listen to yourself. There's that kind of magical moment there. How can we kind of capture that with new technology?
Yeah, or everyone's
and kind of give people access to those kind of moments more seamlessly.
And everyone's got lots of pictures of themselves from when they were 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, and you have a nice little kind of visual catalog of yourself developing through that age. But what probably none of us really have is a catalog of our language development, which is even probably more dramatic year over year, you know, or even month over month. So it's a way to capture a little bit of little slices of time throughout early childhood language acquisition as well, just because it's got little audio clips that you can record. The other thing about audio, which is really tricky, is unlike photography, if if your child is taking their first steps, you're gonna have a moment at least to go find the camera, and like hopefully it starts up rather quickly and you get a snapshot of somebody taking their first steps or taking a dive up the diving board or something. But when someone says something, excuse me, it's gone, right? Like if someone says, "Mommy, you're the best mommy I've ever had," you're like, okay, it's too late to go find a tape recorder because it's already gone. So one of the little magic elements of this box is that,
You're saying too much, man.
I'm joking. No. This will all be out on Kickstarter. No, it's promotional. Is that, we have the ability to kind of TiVo, kind of go back and capture that audio, even though it's past. So it's sort of one of those like magic boxes that we're creating. And the great thing about it is about Kickstarter is it enables people, just like any of us in this room, to kind of come up with their great American novel, come up with a great idea, and not have all the barriers of like, well, I can't sell it to Mattel, so I guess I'm done. And I think someone said recently, every time you do that, a little piece of you dies. So wouldn't it be great if you just had the opportunity to pursue those ideas that everyone in this audience has, one or two or maybe more of those ideas, and just kind of freaking go for it for once, So we're structured in such a way that we don't only have to deal with clients coming from Fortune 100. We can also take projects on like this and help people without millions of dollars of backing develop and execute on what we think might be a fantastic idea.
And the other thing, we want you guys to stay tuned. For CES, there'll be some fun stuff that we'll be launching with some of our Fortune 100 companies. And we'll be sharing some of that stuff with the Core 77 crew, some exciting, inspirational stuff. So that's it.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks. Cheers, guys.
Questions?
Yeah, questions?
Can you divulge how long your buffer might be for your Chatterbox?
How long the buffer is?
Yeah.
We're kind of experimenting with that right now because
the recording buffer.
Yeah, you take 24 hours of recording, and then there's silence. Okay, I got it down, and then there's screaming and crying, which you don't want, and so kind of working that algorithm is kind of the main challenge, and so I don't think we've kind of established exactly.
No, but I think it's quite
buffer.
feasible. Like if you kind of measure MP3 sizes and what how cheap like a gig of memory is, right? That you could easily fit 24-hour MP3 on 1 gig stick, which costs nothing. So you could easily have 24-hour buffer, most of which is thrown away, because we're 365 days a year, so even like a minute a day is 365 minutes, which is 6 hours.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting
it's a lot,
positioning challenges, like, well, why isn't it just an app, or what about the physical component versus the digital, and why don't I just use my phone to record? So there's lots of challenges to think through with that product, and we feel there's some core value there that is pretty interesting, and so just trying to bring that and make it physical is kind of the challenge.
And try different things out as well. I mean, that's part of the prototyping, right? That we've been playing with.
Mm-hmm.
So.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So on the process that you guys are talking about, going from linear to more agile or adaptable, how do you keep your clients assured that, how do they feel safe at the end of the day? With the linear process, it seems safe because it seems like you're going to come up with a final design.
Yeah.
How do you talk about the adaptable route?
The reality is there's still checkpoints, and time is still linear, so we can't bend time. So there's still checkpoints set up, and I think the thing that's reassuring is you see tangible design earlier in the process, and so for them they start to see like, okay, well, I have all these abstract ideas and strategies, and I can start to envision what that's like or not in reality. So when I kind of make something for the brand, is it like this or like this? And so they get a chance to kind of respond to that end point sooner in the process. So I think we're finding it's actually kind of more comforting to be able to make that connection, because I think a lot of the challenge with the strategy gap is that you talk about and align on these words and abstract ideas, but you don't yet have what that looks like and feels like yet. And so that's the gap that's almost always there. That's what design is there to solve, to cross that gap from the kind of verbal to visual. But if you can help people kind of look across that gap and see what's on the other side a little bit earlier, it's actually kind of more comforting.
Yeah, it's not that you wouldn't be doing any of those processes, right? It's not that you would forego research or ideation or sort of design methodologies. It's just that you're allowing yourself to feel free to jump to the conclusion and bring it back early, or like take it from the end of the process and bring it back to the beginning of the process and test it early on, right? And not having that be limited to like, you guys aren't allowed to start until October because right now we're in the research phase, right? You're like, that's one way to do it. But to answer your question about like, how do you make people feel secure that innovation awaits them? It's like those two words are kind of in conflict, right? Feel safe and secure, and then say you're swinging for the fences. You're like there is a little bit of risk and excitement in this. Neither of these things are, I think, any kind of guarantee that there's like a great innovative idea that's going to change the world at the end of it. It's just that all you can do is maximize your chances at finding these serendipitous moments by creating an environment, creating the right team of people to work with, where you're just maximizing your chances at serendipity.
I really, just through your whole talk, have been really kind of, as you talk about the process, I'm really interested in the way that it seems like it's a really good way to develop kind of an intuitive way to anticipate how your team's going to work. Mm-hmm. Meaning if you're jumping ahead and you're saying, well, I'm going to start working on this because I want to see where this goes while the process is still happening, it seems like a really good way to stay mindful of where people are going behind you, because if you're going to spend all this time prototyping something now that you know you're going to have to redo, you want to be as many steps ahead, even though you're doing it right now. And so you're thinking, it seems like a great way to keep yourself involved in the process while you're prototyping and more active with the people that you're working with, so that by the time you're done with something, you've already revised it, even though it's the first prototype.
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of
like that.
You can create. So I think what you're saying is that if you start prototyping early and you feel intuitively as an intuitive designer that there is a strong solution waiting out here, and if you could just convince people of that, and maybe you can't do it by explaining it, maybe you need to go make that thing or show them, maybe it's a digital prototype or animation, I don't know what field you work in, but like whatever that thing is, that could act as a magnet to the other people working from this end of the tunnel. You're like, this thing is so great that we've got to find ways to connect to that, and we'll build it into our story, right? So if you do that and the team and process allows for that to happen, then you may be able to dig the tunnel from both ends and reverse engineer why this idea was so great to begin with, because it actually fit with our strategy, which we
or why it doesn't, right? So maybe
maybe it doesn't.
Like,
that's
right.
That's the one thing I wanted to say, was that it's vice versa as well. Where we always forget that oftentimes when I used to be on these massive research projects, and it'd be like, all right, here's an insight. An insight's an idea. And you forget that an insight's a beginning of an idea. You forget that it has to be stress test. So vice versa. It's really about grabbing down and quickly stress testing it.
Yeah.
And then sometimes this goes back to our philosophy of being actionable, right? Sometimes it might be right, but just not for that time because that person can't bring it to life. So then we have to prototype a way to slowly get that brand or company to be able to do it by doing a roadmap and then continuing to prototype. which is equally as important, right?
Yeah, and a lot of times, like, it's weird, like, I don't know, like when me and Toby have done projects together or whatever, I found that, like, when I'm like thinking about, okay, this is what I'm gonna do. They're gonna do their thing and then I'm gonna do my thing. And then I expect them, I don't think about what they're gonna do, and I sit on my haunches, you know, and then they get done, and then I'm like, oh, that's not what I thought they were gonna do, and now I've gotta do this, but I thought it was gonna be this way. Whereas if I had just jumped ahead, the whole time I was making that prototype, I would have been thinking about, well, what if they do this, what if they do that? I would have been so much more mindful about where they were going to go with it, you know, because I'm already in the process. Like, I think that's really cool.
And we do that together. That's the other thing, right? I mean, like, it's the importance between, everyone sells collaboration, everyone sells diversity, but it's about the right collaboration that's very important, right? It's about, you know, for example, when we're working together and at this point we're solving for UI and we know it's going to affect some of the product stuff, we're working on it and kicking its ass together. You know what I mean? We're making sure that, you know, whatever affects here is going to affect here. Yeah. So if we were to be like, all right, you solve that, I solve this, cheers, we bring it back together, it's not going to be as integrated as you think. Right?
Yeah, maybe all right. It, like, at best, to be like pretty good, maybe. You know, I think what's interesting about maybe it's the size of teams too. Is just like smaller teams and just there can't be any barriers. Is that I'm an interaction designer by trade, Ovid industrial designer by trade, but we don't have that distinction when we're working on a problem together. I am, you know, it's no secret, like the shittiest sketcher, you know, that I know. but I can have some good ideas, right? Yeah, and I'll sketch them in terrible perspective, and then Ovid will be like, what are you getting at? You know, it's like, well, it works like this. He's like, oh, okay, and then he'll just quickly re-sketch it for me. I'm like, yes. Okay, so that might be a good or it might be a bad idea. It's not like every idea is good, right? But we'll equally, you know, be able to call each other on our bad ideas. So I think just being able to iterate like that, not having those barriers and being able to jump to the end and back to the beginning and, you know, kind of keep working on the ideas until they get more and more refined. And you're like, it's so far it's working pretty well.
Along those lines, can you share some stories of bad ideas you might have had, or some glorious failures?
Bad ideas. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't have any, but
yeah, I don't know if we could share some of that stuff.
I can tell you in general that the format of my bad ideas, as pointed out by Ovid, tend to be of the Sky Mall variety. Where
I was going to say, I thought his chess clock idea was a bad idea until he actually sketched it. Now I think it's a good idea.
Yeah.
You can't reveal that.
Often mine take the form of like, and it's also it's also a bottle opener. You know?
Yeah. I think what I have more is uncertain ideas. Like, I don't know if they're bad or not. Like, they seem good to me, and I have tons of them, but it's like, are they just good to me, or are they is it $1 billion idea? Like, I often don't know, you know, so that's, for me, really helpful, having other people to kind of bounce that off of and filter, where you just throw that idea out, and it's like, you can tell, when you start interacting with someone, you can tell, you start building on it, and it becomes more than it originally was. It's like, yeah, okay, that's a good idea. Even if they say, oh yeah, it's kind of interesting, and it kind of ends there, like, that's not as powerful as something that is a spark for some larger exploration. So, you know, I think I had more uncertain ideas. I don't know if they're bad or not.
And it's good to balance off, right? I mean, like Tom said, I mean, he tends to like go in there and look at some of the features. I tend to forget about some of them. So together, I mean, you know, I wouldn't call them arguments, but different ways of approaching it is very important, because you start sanding an approach and an idea that makes sense, you know what I mean? And it starts, again, we start looking at, well, really, does it make sense? Do we defeature it? Do we add the feature? And then we quickly prototype it on paper, or quickly figure out a way to do it. And oftentimes we all start with a pretty bad idea, to answer your question, but then figure out a way to sand it into something that makes sense, you know? And at the end of the day, that is the craftsman mentality, or the maker mentality, that we've, you know, adopted. Sorry.
So I'm gathering you guys are pretty constrained about how much you can talk about the projects you're working on. Is this the case?
Yeah, for now.
Yeah,
right.
I'm feeling that.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah, right.
It's probably killing you not talking about exactly what you're working on.
Yeah.
So I just want to let you know I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Cheers. Thanks.
I know you want to talk about it. I know you want to hear it. But
Right.
Yep.
So you guys are talking about prototyping, and you're not only like physical prototypes, but prototyping strategy and prototyping brands and prototyping markets. What does that look like for those things that are less tangible physical objects?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's anywhere from paper prototypes to kind of sketches on whiteboards
to images. I mean, sometimes we just print a bunch of stuff out and like really nail down that
trying
tone.
to get a vibe and tone right,
and then go back and forth. Well, so for example, if we have like this overall tone that we're going, we're like, okay, this is this brand's tone. This is where we're moving it. This is where we're evolving it. And then we go in and we're sketching some of the ideas to see if it's actually working or not. Then we'll go out and start putting some stuff up, or even the good old Post-its, not to sound corny, they do work. Let's be honest, they're quick, they're easy, put them up and they're great.
There's many different ways you could model what a brand or a strategy looks like. You just get up on a board and draw a Venn diagram and say like, it's the intersection of this, that, and the other, right? And then you can start to say what kind of products, features, and services fill those little intersections between those concepts and which don't. Some things might be really cool, but they don't kind of fall into this definition of a brand. So you can sort of stress test that.
I'm actually a big fan of looking at things more closely. So if I'm coming up with some new product category, I'll go look at the existing products in the market and just look at the company and like literally draw their product line architecture. Like what words, how are they organizing their products and what are they calling just by looking at things more closely, you can actually understand that and like, okay, well, what's my version of that? Is that confusing to people or not? And doing, your version of that. So, it's looking at product line, looking at their messaging is another one, like just how do they talk about their company? And just looking more closely at that, I think and then modeling that for your problem is a great way to just build prototypes of product line strategy, messaging architecture. I mean, all that stuff you can do just by looking at existing. It's kind of actually a good practice to be able to do that with different brands. Just kind of reverse engineer. I mean, what they do and say, what they sell is all out there. And just looking at that, and saying, okay, yeah, that's their point of view. They want to
like what happens if you take like something like banal and traditional like financial analysis tools, and then you throw like, I'm doing the Venn diagrams thing, but you throw like a little circle of fun onto it. And you're like, what's in this intersection of fun and financial tools? You're like, well, that's sort of what Mint kind of draws on, right? You're like, you guys use Mint, or if you don't, you should. It's pretty interesting. But and the messaging, the way they talk about stuff, you'll get a little email saying, hey, we noticed you got a couple ATM fees. Yeah, we hate those too. It's not a way that a bank and financial institutions have tended to talk before Mint, and now they're kind of catching up a little bit, realizing that it's okay to not be so serious about money. You won't be looked at as insecure or a joke. That it's actually quite approachable.
Yeah.
Kind of along the lines of prototyping, like when you guys, I saw like one of the things that there were companies as far as like a big wheel to like maybe a phone or something like that. When you do the user kind of figuring out who's going to use it and how it's used, say a big wheel. So you guys make prototype a big wheel, get on it, be like, oh, this is what the kids will feel like. Or how do you guys go about like having people use those things to say, oh, this is how it's going to be used? Do you have a team for that?
Yeah, I mean it's a balance of so starting off, it's a balance of 2D and then 3D and then bringing it to life as fast as possible, from foam to it could be cardboard sometimes, and then trying to get people on it as fast as you can, right? I think that we forget that we're actually, you have to embrace your network. Dave has kids, right? So it's fantastic, and he has a good age group, you know what I mean? So for us, it's like being able to embrace that and saying, hey, Dave, bring your kids around for a little bit, or like let's quickly just stress test some of these things. With consumer electronics, like for example, with headphones, I mean, you have to get as quickly as possible into getting them on your head. So yeah, maybe you'll get some sketching, you'll get some quick cardboard models 1-to-1, but then get into 3D CAD and print them. I mean, there's so many technologies out there that are a lot easier than they used to be. You know what I mean? Like, prototyping is important to be hands-on, but sometimes you have to be smart and say, okay, if it's faster for me to do this in CAD and then get it printed as an object or as an SLA, let's do that to get some of the moving aspects that I'm going to start seeing here. You know what I mean? And stuff that's closer to your body and that's so much lifestyle oriented is less forgiving than stuff that isn't, right? So
if there's electronics involved at all, there's so many more tools available now. Like there's things like Arduino or Flash, even just quickly like prototyping what would have taken, you know, a team of nerds a month to do in firmware before, like, you know, you can do in an afternoon and just kind of get a feel for, like, this interface is just a little bit too weird, you know, maybe this interface over here, this is a great find, you know, you're able to mock stuff up. Like, to me, Flash is like foam is to an industrial designer. You know, you can just quickly test interaction ideas.
I mean, we did that using a mix of things where sometimes, you know, you're prototyping on the screen, but you can activate, you know, use some sort of more tangible thing if it is more tangible to represent what's on screen.
I mean, we can MacGyver thing, you know, it's just like whatever works, right?
And that in itself is a creative act, coming up how to prototype something easily.
Well, what happens is sometimes you'll pitch an idea that's a little bit novel to a corporate client that maybe has a traditional way of engineering a product, and they'll think that maybe you can't do that, and then you have this magic moment where you get to sort of like whip out a cobbled together, you know, MacGyver prototype. We're like, well, really? Because we made it work, and we're not even engineers, right? I'm like, oh, so that's actually, you know, got a lot of power to it.
Yeah, I'll tell a story about Tom prototyping, the magic of prototyping. He had come up with kind of this you know, touch wall concept, and the client's in the presentation room, and he had someone else outside with a projector shooting an image onto the frosted glass from behind. So in the conference room, it looks like kind of an image on frosted glass. And then, you know, the presentation, he gets up and goes over and starts touching it, and it starts reacting to him. And it was really the person back there looking for his finger on the frosted glass and then like clicking on something. And, you know, so it was completely smoke and mirrors. And they were just like, that's amazing. I can't believe it. And even after we told them, like, we opened the door and see there's somebody out there, they were like, how did you do that touch wall? Like, they just... so I think it's getting creative like that, you know, and just even using sleight of hand and just stupid, simple things you can simulate the experience like it was real.
Yeah, I mean, that was a makeable thing, and we did wind up making that at our previous agency. Right. And the thing about it is, like, you don't always have to wait for huge advances in technology to create the unimaginable. Often it's just that stuff is already there. It just takes a little bit of rethinking on how to use it. You know, like the same chipset that landed a lunar lander on the moon is like, that is the lousiest computer, but you can do a lot with it, right? You don't. In other words, like, today's computers aren't of a different kind. Yeah. They just run faster. Right. So it's like anything you can do today, you could have done back then. It just would have been really slow. Yeah.
Right.
And this comes through with the physical as well, right? Where, you know, again, just going back into headphones, you can grab existing stuff, chop it up. You know, if you know you want a square muff with a certain type of fit, go buy the two and chop them up. Duct tape is not necessarily a bad thing in that example, right? As far as overall fit and proportions and so on, it's equally as important to be able to not be scared to have something precious, or even a full model. If you see it there, and wow, I just got this CNC'd and I'm looking there, don't be scared to go in there and beat it up or mark it up with a Sharpie. I mean, that's all part of the act of creating, right?
I mean, at some point then we make it freaking beautiful and get like expensive cosmetic models made that you can't tell whether that's a real object or a model, you know, that kind of thing. That also has its place. But as far as the act of creating, testing, touching something, feeling it early on in the process, you know, you can't beat the just try anything kind of method. Well, thank you very much. This is a tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
All right, thanks guys. That was awesome. The next Curiosity Club is October 11th. We have Matt Foster of Foster Knives. Matt Foster has spent his entire career working in the sporting goods and shooting sports industry. His professional experience with knives and design began at Gerber Legendary Blades. Noticing that there was a market niche not being served by existing makers and designers, he taught himself to design and make his own brand of knives. Experience gained from designing his own knives led him to design and create other products relevant to his career. Scope mounts, shotgun stocks, gun cleaning equipment, and firearms accessories. Should be really interesting. Yeah, very excited about it. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you guys. So, I have an entirely new market here through Chatterbox.
Oh, really?
Education part of the